Coming up next, more detractor content and after that Dragon Ball Z, only on Toonami.
I will say this, all right? Last few times that I've done the suggestion box, all right? A lot of people are like, well, when you do the suggestion box, you seem to get angry or upset. And if that's the case, then what's the point of the suggestion box? Well, here's the thing you have to understand. When the suggestion box, the point of the suggestion box is supposed to be constructive criticism, saying, here's a suggestion for you that perhaps would help you to improve and grow, all right? What I'm getting a lot in the suggestion box are very, very big, like, demands. Like, it's not, oh, so you should really do this thing because this will improve your content. It's more like, I just don't like this, so stop doing it. That's not constructive criticism. Constructive criticism is, listen, here's something that you can do to improve. Here's why it would improve your content. And here's, some examples of how it would either benefit you or how it's benefited others. And we feel it will apply to your content, or how people have said that this is something beneficial. That's different from, I just don't like your podcast, so stop doing it, or shorten your podcast dramatically. And then I explain, well, I don't understand why you would ask that, because all evidence points towards the podcast doing really well. The viewership on the podcast has done well. Engagement during the podcast is great. I've actually had some days where all my support came in during the podcast. And when I started playing the game, the whole stream dried up. We lost hundreds of viewers and we didn't get any support for the rest of the stream. Everything is pointing towards me doing more style of podcast. Why are you asking for less podcast? And every time I say that, I don't get a valid response. I just get, oh, I think it's boring. I want more gameplay. Make the podcast shorter. That's not constructive criticism. That's your personal demands. I don't need personal demands. I don't want to know specifically what you like and don't like. That's not suggestions. That's your own pet peeves with my content. That's not a constructive criticism. You understand the
DSP once again proving to us that he doesn't understand how the English language works. Essentially, basically, his view of what a constructive criticism is getting his hog fluffed while receiving no actual constructive criticism, just basically hand-holding through this process. Criticism, whether it's constructive or not, in general, is a matter of opinion. His take on this is so, I guess, out of touch, because I don't think he's ever really been in a position where you would receive, regular feedback from peers or supervisors or leads to then adjust projects that you've worked on. DSP, anyone that's in a creative field that is either pursuing some sort of art degree or is in an artistic field or creative field, constructive criticism generally comes from the perspective of something not clicking well with the viewer. So by saying something like, oh, I don't like this, and this is how I think you should change it, is constructive criticism. Straight up criticism would just be like, I think this is bad, and then no follow-up. And because DSP doesn't really understand, he's just taking anything that could be deemed as actual criticism as just that. The fact that he's trying to paint suggestions that say, hey, you spend too much time doing your podcast where you could be playing games and addressing questions as well, it's a valid suggestion. He has this weird arbitrary rule where he needs his podcast to last however long it is, like an hour or something like that, hour and a half. I only see clips, so I don't know how long he generally tries to stretch that thing out. But if people are saying, hey, we think this goes on too long, if you shortened it, you can get into gameplay faster, and then you won't be complaining about all the games that you're playing and spending so much time on. He is his own, worst enemy, because he creates his own problems, then complains about his problems, and then when people try to say, hey, this is how you can fix this, he then complains about that and then doesn't fix anything. Besides, the ego stroking suggestions and literal hand holding for technical issues that he has with OBS or lighting or whatever, anything beyond that he will deem as just straight up insult. This is realistically what he needs to do. Get rid of the suggestion box, because all it does is it paints himself in an even worse light when he sits there and criticizes people that actually provide actual legitimate feedback on what the audience wants. He needs to actually shorten his stupid podcast and start addressing things while he's playing games, because that's what everybody else does. As much as he's like, oh, you've been brainwashed into thinking that's the status quo and you're wrong and this and that. The reason that that is the actual status quo, another word that DSP doesn't understand, is because it works. It works for big streamers. And they get big because they know how to balance addressing the audience and playing the game and keeping everybody entertained. I don't watch a lot of streamers. I'll watch Dr. Disrespect on occasion just because like he plays like PUBG sometimes. That's really when I watched him a lot, when he used to play with Shroud. And I watch Germa essentially. And both of those individuals are really good at balancing, maintaining like attention to the game and entertaining the audience at the same time. And because like DSP for some reason feels like he needs to separate the two. Like the audience needs to be addressed only in the podcast, and then it needs to all be gameplay after the podcast, and no personal conversations or addressing anything else. And then the reason it would actually benefit him to do that, to shorten the podcast and actually have these conversations during gameplay, is then you aren't just exhausting everybody's money like off the podcast. He complains about like, oh, well, you know, the gameplay isn't making any money. Right, because you're exhausting everything beforehand. People are only going to give you so much money. Like, I don't know how deep you think everybody's pockets are. And realistically, you're only getting money from like a handful of people. So I don't know how this isn't like blatantly obvious to this man when it's obvious to everybody else around him, like especially in this detractor community. We understand what's going on in his community much better than he does, which is a wild thing to say, that he's so oblivious to how he hasn't grown an actual community because he constantly bans people. He's constantly just a negative person, which doesn't want to make new people come and check him out. And yes, there is a community, like because of us, we are basically like a barrier that people have to pass through to get to him. You're more likely to see detractor content and the real side of Phil and be turned off because of that. And so people don't actually end up watching him because they're already exposed to his toxicity before they can actually see his content. At the end of the day, DSP, learn to actually take feedback from people and, you know, be an adult about it, or just get off the internet.